Richard Blake laughed, turned to the crowd of investors on the deck of a $40 million yacht, and pointed directly at Daniel Carter. "Somebody get the help to stop wandering around up here." The laughter spread fast. Victoria covered her mouth with two fingers, not to hide shock, to hide a smile. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move a single muscle in his face. He just looked at Richard the way a man looks at something he already owns. Because he did. Every plank of teak under Richard's Italian shoes, every engine below the waterline, every crew member standing at attention on that deck, they all answered to one name. And it wasn't Richard Blake. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see where this story lands. Subscribe and don't move, because what happens next on this yacht, nobody saw it coming. There's a kind of silence that follows a man after a divorce. Not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of a Sunday morning when the house is still, and the coffee is hot, and everything feels right with the world. No. This is a different kind of silence. It's the silence of rooms that used to have two voices, and now only have one. It's the silence of a little girl asking, "Daddy, where did Mommy go?" and a man searching for words that won't crack his throat open when he says them. That was the silence Daniel Carter lived in for the first year after Victoria left. I didn't talk about it much. He never really talked about anything much. That had always been the complaint, hadn't it? "You never open up, Daniel. You never let me in. You're always somewhere else in your head." Victoria had said those things so many times over their 12 years of marriage that he had almost started to believe them. Almost started to believe that being quiet meant being broken. That choosing to think before you spoke was the same as not caring at all. But Daniel Carter wasn't broken. He was building. He just did it where nobody could see. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, a town that smells like salt water and old money, though his family had plenty of the first and none of the second. His father worked the docks his whole life, repairing vessel hulls and managing cargo manifests for the kind of men who never knew his name, but relied completely on his hands. Daniel used to sit on the pier after school and watch those ships come in enormous steel bodies moving through the water like they owned the world, and he'd think somebody has to know how all of this works. Somebody has to understand what keeps a thing that size moving in the right direction. He decided early that he was going to be that somebody. He put himself through 2 years of community college, then transferred to a maritime logistics program in Charleston on a partial scholarship. He worked nights loading cargo. He spent his weekends volunteering on a commercial fishing vessel just to learn the mechanical rhythms of how boats talked to the people who ran them. By the time he was 26, he had more practical hours on the water than men twice his age, and companies were starting to notice. He met Victoria at 28. She was beautiful in the way that makes a practical man suddenly feel like the world has more color in it than he remembered. She laughed easily. She moved through rooms like she belonged in every one of them. She had grown up with more than Daniel had, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable. The kind of comfortable where certain things were simply expected, and certain things were simply beneath consideration. Daniel wasn't beneath consideration then. He was rising. He had a real salary, a solid reputation, and the quiet confidence of a man who had earned everything he had with his own two hands. Victoria saw that. In the early years, she said she loved that about him. What she didn't say, what maybe she didn't even know yet, was that she loved the direction of it. She loved the idea of where Daniel was going. She loved him as a destination, not a person. And destinations, once you arrive at them, are never quite as satisfying as the journey made you believe they'd be. Their daughter Lily was born on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 years into their marriage. Daniel had been on a vessel inspection off the Georgia coast when Victoria called, and he drove 4 hours through a coastal thunderstorm, soaking wet. Radio crackling, hands tight on the wheel to get to the hospital before she was born. He made it with 40 minutes to spare. He held Lily before the nurses had even finished cleaning her up, and he looked down at this tiny, red-faced, furious little person, screaming her arrival into the world, and something inside him reorganized completely. This is it, he thought. Everything else is just context. He would later say, in the rare moments when he allowed himself to speak about things that mattered, that Lily was the decision he made every single morning when he got out of bed. Not his career, not his company, not his bank account. Lily. Every choice, every sacrifice, every hour of work, it all flowed from that one irreducible fact. Victoria had her own facts, and over time they started to point in different directions. The trouble didn't start with any single thing. That's the lie people tell themselves after marriages end, that there was a moment, a confrontation, a specific breaking point they can point to like a crack in a wall. But most marriages don't break. They erode. They lose ground slowly, inch by inch, the way a shoreline gives way to water that never stops moving. Victoria started spending more time with her sister's social circle, a group of men and women who collected experiences the way other people collected debts. Restaurants that required reservations 3 months in advance. Vacations to places Daniel couldn't take time off to reach. Events where the entrance fee was as much as his monthly truck payment. Daniel didn't begrudge her those things. He wasn't a jealous man by nature, and he wasn't insecure about what he had or didn't have. He just knew the math. He knew what was coming and what was going out, and what they needed to keep Lily's world stable and growing. He knew that chasing appearances was the fastest way to hollow out a foundation that could otherwise hold weight for decades. He tried to explain this. Victoria heard something different. She heard no. She heard you're not enough. She heard I don't want to give you the life you deserve. And once a person starts hearing a word that was never spoken, it's nearly impossible to unspeak it. Richard Blake entered the picture quietly, the way men like Richard always do. He didn't announce himself. He didn't position himself as a threat, at least not at first. He was simply around at the dinner parties, at the charity events, at the gatherings that Daniel worked late to fund, but rarely had time to attend. Richard was the kind of man who wore success like a costume. Everything about him was calibrated to signal power without the inconvenience of actually producing it. The watch, the haircut, the way he held a drink at exactly the right angle in photographs. He had made money in commercial real estate during a good market run, and had confused the luck of timing with the skill of genius, the way a lot of men do when the numbers work out in their favor, and nobody around them is honest enough to tell them otherwise. He spoke in the language of impressions. Daniel spoke in the language of outcomes. They were not compatible dialects. The first time Daniel shook Richard's hand at some fundraiser he'd been pulled to by Victoria, he looked the man in the eyes and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, not anger, something quieter, something more like recognition. This man, Daniel thought, has never built anything that would last without him standing next to it. I didn't say it. He rarely said the things he thought in those moments. He smiled, shook hands, and got back in his truck and drove home thinking about a client proposal he needed to finish before morning. Victoria told him she wanted a divorce on a Wednesday evening in October. Lily was 7 years old and asleep down the hall. Victoria sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten 1,000 dinners, where Lily had drawn her first pictures with crayons, where Daniel had spread out navigation charts and contract documents, and tried to build a future out of spreadsheets and discipline. And she said the words with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times before having it. I think we want different things, Daniel. I think we've wanted different things for a long time. I think we've both been pretending not to see it. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Is this about Richard? She didn't flinch. That told him something. It's about me, she said. It's about the life I want. And what life is that? She hesitated. A bigger one. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't throw anything or raise his voice or say the things that were fighting each other in his chest, trying to get out. Because Lily was asleep down the hall, and whatever was dying at this table was going to stay at this table. It wasn't going to walk down that hallway and sit beside a 7-year-old girl and poison the rest of her childhood. He stood up. He pushed in his chair. He looked at Victoria one more time, looked at her, the way you look at something you've committed to memory, because you sense you're seeing it for the last time, the way it used to mean something, and he said, all right, just that, all right, and then he went to bed. The divorce was handled the way Daniel handled most difficult things, methodically, without drama, with a precision that people on the outside probably mistook for coldness. He hired a good attorney. He documented everything that needed to be documented. He negotiated custody with the singular goal of maximizing the time Lily spent with a parent who was present and paying attention, which in practical terms meant him. Victoria didn't fight the custody arrangement too hard. She had her new life taking shape, and a 7-year-old daughter with Daniel's quiet eyes and Daniel's stubborn work ethic required a kind of daily attention that didn't photograph well for social media and couldn't be impressed by restaurants or events or the performance of a lifestyle that cost more than it was worth. That was the part Daniel never said out loud, even years later when he had every right to. He never said it. Not to his friends, the few he had. Not to his sister who called from Richmond every Sunday and asked how he was doing in the voice people use when they expect the answer to be bad. Not even to Lily as she grew older and started asking questions that deserved honest answers. He just took his custody days, built his schedule around them like a scaffolding, and made sure that every time Lily walked through the door of whatever home they happened to be living in at the time, she felt like the most important thing in the room. Because she was. The company started the way most real things start, not with a dramatic announcement or a business plan printed on expensive paper, but with a problem that needed solving and a man who knew how to solve it. A former colleague named Pete Garrison called him 6 months after the divorce. Pete managed a small fleet of private charter vessels along the Georgia-Florida coast, and his operation was bleeding money, bad contracts, inefficient fuel management crew, turnover that was eating his margins alive. He'd gone to 3 different consultants. All 3 had handed him reports full of words that didn't translate to anything he could actually do with his hands. "Danny," Pete said on the phone one evening, while Daniel was sitting at his kitchen table with Lily's math homework spread out between them. "I need someone who actually understands how these things move. Not some MBA with a PowerPoint. Someone who's been on the water." "What are you paying?" Daniel asked. Pete named a number. Daniel thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "Send me the operations reports, all of them. Every fuel log, every crew schedule, every maintenance record for the past 3 years. "That's a lot of paper." "I know. Send it anyway." He spent 3 weeks going through Pete's records after Lily went to bed every night. He rebuilt the crew rotation schedule from scratch. He renegotiated 2 vendor contracts. He identified 3 fuel inefficiencies that were costing Pete $8,000 a month and could be corrected with procedural changes that cost nothing. He wrote it all up in a 22-page report that Pete said was the clearest document he'd ever read about anything. Pete's operation turned profitable within 90 days. He told 2 other vessel owners. Those 2 told 4 more. Daniel hired his first employee, a logistics analyst named Marcus Webb, 24 years old, and fresh out of a maritime program at the University of Miami, 13 months after taking Pete's call. He hired his second 6 weeks after that. By the time Lily was 10, Daniel Carter's consulting firm occupied a small office above a shipping supply store in Savannah, employed 11 people, and had clients from Virginia to Texas. He still drove the same truck. He still wore simple clothes. He never mentioned the business at school events, or parent-teacher conferences, or the occasional awkward interaction with mutual friends who looked at him with the particular mix of pity and discomfort that people reserve for the ones they don't quite know how to categorize. Oh, Daniel. He's doing okay. Raising Lily on his own. Working in boats. Something with boats. He let them think that. It was easier than explaining. And he had learned by then that the people who needed to know what he was building would find out when it mattered. The people who didn't need to know could keep their assumptions. Assumptions had never cost him anything he couldn't replace. The years moved the way years do when a man is raising a child and building something at the same time, simultaneously slower and faster than they have any right to be. Some days dragged so long that by the time Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, Daniel would sit at his desk and feel like he'd aged a year in 24 hours. Other times, he'd look up from a contract negotiation or a vessel inspection report and realize 3 weeks had passed without him fully registering any of them. Lily grew up knowing her father as someone who was always there, not in the hovering way, not in the anxious, overcompensating way of fathers who are trying to make up for something. She knew him as someone who showed up at her school plays even when he had calls to take. Someone who made dinner most nights, even when it was just pasta with the jar sauce she liked, and not the elaborate thing he'd been meaning to learn to cook. Someone who sat at the end of her bed when she had a nightmare and didn't talk, just stayed because he understood that presence is sometimes more useful than words. She asked about her mother, of course. Kids always ask. Daniel always answered honestly, which is different from answering completely. He told Lily that her mother had made choices that were right for her, and that those choices had been hard on everyone, and that grown-ups sometimes love each other for a time, and then stop being able to live together, and that none of that was Lily's fault ever in any way for any reason. He said it calmly. He said it without bitterness in his voice, because whatever was in his chest was his to manage, not hers to absorb. Victoria was in the picture on holidays mostly, and the occasional weekend when she and Richard were in town, and not otherwise occupied. Lily was polite with her mother in the careful, measured way of a child who has learned to manage emotional rooms, who knows how to read the temperature of a relationship and navigate it without burning anyone, including herself. She got that from Daniel. She got a lot of things from Daniel. Richard Blake. During all of this, continued to exist in the background of Daniel's life, the way an unpleasant smell does not present enough to demand action, but persistent enough to register every time conditions were right. Daniel heard about Richard's business ventures through the grapevine of coastal business circles, some successful, some less. So, most of them built on the presentation of confidence, rather than the substance of competence. Richard had a talent for appearing in rooms where money was moving and positioning himself close enough to the center of it that people assumed he was responsible for its motion. It was a skill Daniel would give him that. Not an admirable one, but a skill. Victoria and Richard had been together for years now, and whatever she had found in that life, whatever bigger version of existence she'd been reaching for that night at the kitchen table, Daniel genuinely hoped she'd found some version of it. Not out of generosity exactly. More out of the simple practical knowledge that carrying resentment toward a person who has no idea you're carrying it is the least efficient use of energy he could imagine. He had work to do. He had Lily to raise. He had a company to build. He didn't have time to hate Richard Blake. The growth of Carter Maritime Solutions, the name he'd given the company by the time it had grown past the point where calling it a consulting firm felt accurate, was not dramatic in the way business success usually gets presented in stories. There was no single breakthrough meeting, no Hollywood handshake moment where everything changed overnight. It was incremental. It was the result of thousands of small decisions made correctly over years, and the compounded interest of a reputation built on delivering exactly what was promised, and nothing that wasn't. He moved the company to Charleston when Lily was 12. Better access to the port networks, better positioning for the mid-Atlantic client base. He was developing better schools for Lily, which was, if he was honest with himself, the primary variable in the equation. He began acquiring vessel stakes in his early 40s, initially as partial payment from clients who couldn't afford his fees in cash and offered equity in their assets instead. He would take those stakes, restructure the operation, return the vessel to profitability, and then either hold the position or sell it at a return that funded the next phase of growth. By the time Lily was 16, Carter Maritime Solutions had become Carter Maritime Group, an investment and operations firm, with 18 vessels under management offices in Charleston, Miami, and a small operational outpost in Rotterdam. And Daniel Carter was quietly, methodically, without announcement or celebration of any kind, one of the most financially successful people in the private maritime sector on the East Coast. He still drove the same truck. He still wore simple clothes. He still showed up at Lily's school things and made dinner on weeknights and went to church on Sunday mornings at the same Methodist congregation he'd attended since Lily was 8. The people there knew him as the single dad who always arrived exactly on time and shook everybody's hand and remembered their kids' names. They didn't know the rest. He preferred it that way. The call that would eventually lead to everything came on a Thursday afternoon in late September, while Daniel was reviewing a vessel inspection report in his Charleston office. His operations director, a meticulous woman named Sandra Cho, who had been with him for 7 years and knew the texture of his business, the way a good mechanic knows an engine, appeared in his doorway with an expression he recognized. The one that meant, "This is larger than the usual large." "Greystone Capital," she said. "They want to discuss a partnership. Maritime Investment International Expansion. They're hosting a preliminary gathering next month aboard the Aurora." Daniel looked up from the report. He knew the Aurora. Every serious player in East Coast private maritime knew the Aurora. A 140-foot super yacht, launched 4 years prior, one of the most recognized private vessels in the region. He'd seen her specs more than once in trade publications. He'd been approached about consulting on her operational structure 18 months ago by an intermediary he'd chosen not to pursue at the time. "What kind of partnership?" he asked. Sandra handed him the folder. He read it in silence for 6 minutes. "Tell them yes," he said finally. "But I want to review the vessel operations before any agreements are discussed. I'll go aboard personally." "They're expecting business principles," Sandra said carefully. "The event is a certain kind of gathering. People bring staff, they bring—" "I know what it is," Daniel said. "I'm not bringing staff. I'm going to look at the vessel, review the operational framework, and determine whether this is a partnership worth having." Sandra looked at him for a moment. "You're not going to, what, dress up?" He looked down at his shirt. "This is fine." Sandra had worked with him long enough not to argue. He didn't tell Lily about the gathering. She was in her 3rd year of college now, studying business and environmental science at William and Mary, with the kind of focused intelligence that made him feel sometimes like the student in their relationship rather than the teacher. They talked on the phone most Sunday evenings, and he mentioned he'd be traveling for business, which was normal enough to require no further explanation. "I didn't tell anyone, really." He drove himself to the marina. He parked the truck in the public lot like everyone else. He walked down the dock with his folder under his arm and his mind on the operational questions he needed answered before he could make a serious assessment. He was thinking about fuel consumption ratios when he saw them. Victoria came into view first, which was the order that made sense, because Victoria always arrived in a way that was designed to be noticed. The dress was something expensive and blue, the kind of thing that photographers would call elegant, and that cost what Daniel used to pay in monthly rent in his first apartment after the divorce. She was laughing at something, head tilted back slightly. One hand touching Richard's arm, in the way that people touch each other when they're performing a relationship for an audience. Richard was talking to 2 men. Daniel recognized vaguely from financial circles investors, the type who showed up at gatherings like this one to look at opportunities and tell each other they were serious about them. He was doing he always did. The expansive gestures, the large-sounding words, the posture of a man who expects every room to understand, "It's lucky he's in it." Daniel stopped walking. Not from shock. Not from the sudden resurfacing of an old wound. More from the particular pause of a practical man recalibrating around an unexpected variable. Of course, he thought. Of course they're here. He had spent 15 years not running into them. He had built his entire working life on a foundation that was geographically, socially, and professionally separate from the world Victoria had chosen. But apparently, those worlds had decided on this particular Thursday evening at this particular marina to overlap. He kept walking. Victoria saw him before he reached the gangway. He watched the recognition move across her face in stages: confusion. First, then that particular version of something people call amusement, but is really just the reflex of someone who doesn't know how to respond to an unexpected social situation. "Daniel." Her voice carried a tone he recognized. The same one from parent-teacher conferences when she'd shown up and found him already there, already talking to Lily's teacher, already 10 steps ahead in the knowledge of their daughter's world. A tone that was surprised to find him somewhere she hadn't expected him to be. "What are you doing here?" He looked at her. He processed the years between the last time he'd seen her and this moment, the weathering, the changes, the particular way time modifies a face while leaving some essential quality of it intact. "Checking a few things," he said. Richard turned at that point, and the look he gave Daniel was the kind of practiced descending assessment that men who wear expensive watches give to men who don't. A single sweep from shoes to collar, the verdict delivered before any data has actually been considered. "You work here now." He said it the way people say things they mean as jokes, but are also testing, because if the answer turns out to be yes, the the joke can be the cover, and if the answer is no, the laugh can fill the space before the next sentence. Several people nearby had started to listen. Not obviously. The way people listen on yacht decks angled away, pretending to be absorbed in something else, actually absorbing everything. "I'm here to look at the vessel," Daniel said. "The vessel," Richard repeated with the intonation of someone finding the word unnecessarily formal. He looked at the champagne flute in his hand, then at the white uniformed crew member standing near the gangway, then back at Daniel, making a small calculation. "I'm sure the captain would love a tour. You always liked boats, didn't you?" He said this to Victoria, not to Daniel, as if consulting her on the matter of Daniel's relationship with bodies of water. As if Daniel was a subject being discussed, rather than a person standing right there. Victoria gave the smile that was designed to indicate she wasn't really endorsing whatever was happening, but didn't want to stop it either. "You always liked boats," she said to Daniel, as a confirmation rather than a compliment. As a placement. As if the most useful thing that could be said about a man in this moment on this deck among these people was that he had a fondness for maritime vessels. As if that was the ceiling of his relevance to this world. Daniel felt nothing combative rise in him. This was perhaps the thing that still surprised him most about himself after all these years. Not the success, not the discipline, but the genuine absence of the rage that a person in his position would be entitled to feel. The absence wasn't suppression. It wasn't performance. It was just the simple result of having spent 15 years building something real. Something that didn't require anyone else's acknowledgement to be true. He had what he had. He knew what he knew. He was standing where he was standing. What Richard Blake thought about any of that had exactly zero operational significance. "Could you get someone to refill this?" Richard held out the champagne flute. He held it toward Daniel. In front of the investors. In front of Victoria. In front of the crew members near the gangway, who had gone very, very still. The deck had gone quiet in that particular way of a situation that everyone present has recognized as significant, but nobody is willing to define out loud. Daniel looked at the glass. He took it. "Sure," he said, and he walked toward the bar. Behind him he heard Richard say something to the investors, something low and self-congratulatory, and heard the polite, uncertain laughter that people produce when they're not quite sure if they should be laughing. He didn't turn around. He set the flute on the bar counter, nodded to the crew member behind it, and kept walking down the starboard side of the deck, past the main salon entrance toward the bridge, where the captain was finishing his pre-departure checks. Captain Michael Reeves had worked with Daniel for 4 years. He was a careful, precise man in his late 50s, who had spent 3 decades on the water and had the permanent squint of someone who has looked into more wind than most people ever will. He turned from his checklist when Daniel appeared in the bridge doorway. "Mr. Carter." A nod. Professional. Warm underneath the precision. "Inspection report is ready whenever you want it." "I'll need a few minutes," Daniel said. The captain looked past him toward the deck where the gathering was assembling. "Anything I should know about before departure?" Daniel considered the question for exactly as long as it deserved. "There may be some requests," he said, "from guests who aren't familiar with vessel operations." "We'll handle it the usual way," the captain said. "The usual way," Daniel agreed. He took the inspection report from the captain's hand. He opened it. He began to read. Outside on the deck. Richard Blake was telling his investors about the yacht, its history, its significance, its standing, as one of the premier private vessels on the East Coast, in the detailed authoritative voice of a man who has read an article about something and is now prepared to teach a course on it. He didn't know that the man he'd just handed his champagne glass to had reviewed the vessel's operational budget that morning. I didn't know that the man whose clothes he'd assessed and found lacking had signed documents that governed every crew schedule, every fuel account, every maintenance contract on the boat they were standing on. He didn't know yet, but the evening was still young, and the Aurora hadn't left the harbor. The laughter was still fading off the deck when Daniel turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow. The walk of a man who has already decided the outcome of something and sees no reason to rush the arrival. Richard watched him go and felt the satisfaction that small men feel when they believe they've established a hierarchy. He turned back to his investors, Two men named Hal Greer and Tom Fitch, both of whom managed regional capital funds, and both of whom had been nodding along to Richard's presentation with the careful non-committal attention of people who are listening without believing, and spread his hands in a gesture that said, "What can you do?" "You know how it is at these events," Richard said. "Staff wandering where they shouldn't." Hal Greer looked in the direction Daniel had gone. Something in his expression didn't quite match Richard's tone, but Richard wasn't the kind of man who noticed other people's expressions when he was busy managing his own. Victoria had stopped smiling. She was watching the space where Daniel had been standing, and something was moving behind her eyes that she wasn't ready to name yet. A feeling like a thread being pulled, not enough to unravel anything, but enough to feel. She had recognized Daniel immediately, of course. 15 years changes a man's face in certain ways and leaves other things unchanged. And Daniel's eyes had always been the kind that stayed the same regardless of what the rest of him was doing. Steady. Measuring. Looking at the world the way a navigator looks at a chart, not with emotion, but with the quiet authority of someone calculating the most accurate course. She had expected to feel something like pity when she saw him. She had built that expectation over years without realizing she was building it. Some part of her had assembled an image of Daniel at 50, the truck, the simple clothes, the modest life, and filed it under the category of choices that confirm I made the right one. But standing on that deck, watching him take Richard's empty glass without a word, without a flinch, without a single micro-expression of humiliation, she felt something entirely different. She felt unsettled. She just didn't know why yet. Daniel was at the far end of the deck now near the bridge companionway, speaking quietly with a crew member. He had the folder open. He was pointing at something in it. The crew member was nodding. He looked, Victoria thought, and she immediately tried to unthink it, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Down below in the engine room access corridor, a junior crew member named Travis found the chief steward, Elena Marsh, and relayed what had happened on deck. Elena had been with the Aurora's operation for 2 years. She knew who Daniel Carter was. She knew what it meant when Mr. Carter arrived aboard personally. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she straightened her jacket and went to find Captain Reeves. The captain was already moving. Richard Blake had not yet finished his sentence to Hal Greer. When he became aware that the energy on the deck had shifted in some way he couldn't immediately locate. It was subtle. The crew had realigned themselves slightly, not dramatically, not in any way you could point to, but in the way a room full of people unconsciously orients toward whoever actually has authority in it. The captain appeared at the top of the companionway. He walked across the deck with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has been at sea long enough to know that urgency looks different from speed. He walked past Richard, past the investors, past Victoria, who watched him go with the beginning of a question forming on her face. He walked to Daniel. Richard watched this and felt the first faint signal of something wrong. The signal was faint enough that he overrode it immediately, the way confident men always override the signals that their confidence has exceeded their actual position. "Captain," Richard called across the deck loud enough that the investors could hear. "I was just telling these gentlemen about the vessel. When do we depart?" The captain paused. He turned. He looked at Richard Blake with the patient, unbothered expression of a man who has dealt with difficult passengers for 30 years and has developed an absolute immunity to being impressed by them. "We depart when the owner authorizes departure," the captain said. Richard blinked. "Right," he said, recovering smoothly. "And who do I speak to about adjusting the owner?" the captain said again. Then he turned back to Daniel. The silence that fell over that portion of the deck was the specific kind of silence that happens when a room full of intelligent people has simultaneously received a piece of information they haven't yet processed. Hal Greer had gone very still. Tom Fitch had lowered his drink slightly. 3 other guests nearby had stopped their separate conversations and were watching with the instinctive attention of people who recognize that something significant is happening directly in front of them, even if they can't yet say exactly what it is. Victoria had gone completely still. She watched the captain walk to Daniel. She watched Daniel close the folder and say something to the captain in a low voice. She watched the captain nod, not the nod of a crew member receiving instructions from a guest, but the nod of a professional receiving direction from the person responsible for all of it. The thread that had been pulling at her all evening pulled a little harder. "Mr. Carter." The captain's voice carried across the deck with the clarity that salt air gives to sound. "The inspection report is complete. We're cleared for departure on your authorization." The deck went quiet like someone had turned a dial. Richard's head turned slowly. Hal Greer's hand stopped halfway to his mouth with his drink in it. Tom Fitch said very quietly to no one in particular, "Did he just say Carter?" Richard's expression ran through 4 different configurations in the space of 2 seconds. The first was confusion, genuine, unguarded, the look of a man whose mental map has just been handed a feature that wasn't there before. The second was reassessment, fast and calculating, running back through the last 40 minutes looking for the thing he'd missed. The third was something that might have been the beginning of embarrassment if Richard Blake were the kind of man capable of feeling it quickly. The fourth settled into what he defaulted to when the ground moved under him, the performance of certainty. "Carter," Richard said. He said it like he was checking whether he'd heard it correctly, like maybe there was a different Carter, like maybe this was a clerical situation. The captain said without looking at Richard, "Daniel Carter is the owner of the Aurora." Nobody spoke. Daniel hadn't turned around during any of this. He was still looking at the inspection report, pen moving across a notation on the second page. He finished the notation. He capped the pen. He closed the folder. Then he turned. He looked at Richard Blake. And Richard Blake looked back at him, and in that moment, 15 years of assumptions collapsed into the space of a single second, and the champagne glass he'd handed to Daniel Carter, handed to him in front of investors, in front of a crowd, with the casual authority of a man who has never once doubted his right to hand things to people, became the most expensive gesture Richard had ever made in his life. Richard started. "The inspection's clean," Daniel said to the captain. "We can depart." He walked toward the main salon. He didn't look at Richard again. Hal Greer watched him go. Then he looked at Richard. Then he looked at Tom Fitch. Something passed between them. The specific wordless communication of 2 men who have simultaneously recalculated everything about the room they are standing in. Richard's mouth was still slightly open. Victoria hadn't moved at all. She was looking at the door through which Daniel had disappeared, and the thread that had been pulling at her had now become something else entirely. Something that pulled from the inside, from a place she thought she'd closed off a long time ago in a kitchen at a table on a Wednesday night in October. The engines of the Aurora came to life below her feet. Rich, deep, and entirely indifferent to the human drama playing out on the deck above them. The yacht began to move. Inside the main salon. Daniel sat down at the round table near the starboard windows and opened his laptop. He had 3 emails to review before the Greystone Capital presentation began. He answered 2 of them. He flagged the third for Sandra's attention in the morning. He could feel the energy of the yacht shifting as the information spread from person to person across the deck. The quiet cascade of recalibration that happens when a group of people who thought they understood a situation discover they were operating on the wrong information. He'd felt it before in business meetings when a deal turned in an unexpected direction. In negotiations, when the party that believed it held all the leverage discovered it didn't. He recognized the texture of that moment. He knew how long it lasted and what it settled into afterward. I didn't feel satisfaction about it. That surprised people when they found out about him, when they eventually understood the full shape of what he'd built. They expected something in him that corresponded to the drama of the reveal, some version of triumph or vindication that matched the scale of what had just happened on the deck. But the truth was that Daniel Carter had lived with the knowledge of what he'd built for long enough that Richard Blake's expression of discovery added exactly nothing to it. He wasn't more successful because Richard now knew it. He hadn't been less successful when Richard didn't. That was the whole point of building something real. It existed independent of who was watching. He ordered coffee from the steward who appeared at the salon door. He asked for it black. He went back to his emails. Out on the deck. Richard was doing what Richard always did when the ground moved. He was talking. Fast, filling the air with words the way people stuff a cracked wall with material to keep the cold out. He was saying things to Hal Greer and Tom Fitch, about knowing Daniel, about history between families, about this kind of situation, being the reason private business circles were so interesting. Weren't they? You never knew who you'd run into. Wasn't that fascinating? Hal Greer was listening with the polite, closed expression of a man who has already moved Daniel Carter from one mental column to another, and is in the process of doing the same for Richard Blake, and the movement is not in Richard's favor. Tom Fitch had excused himself and walked to the starboard railing, where he stood looking at the retreating shoreline and thinking about what he'd just watched happen, and what it said about the judgment of the man he'd been considering doing business with. Victoria had gone to the aft deck. She stood with her hands on the railing and the wind coming off the water, and the city moving slowly away behind the yacht. And she thought about the kitchen table. She thought about the October night, and the words she'd said, and the way Daniel had looked at her when she said them, and then just stood up, pushed in his chair and said, "All right," like it was the final entry in a ledger. She thought about how she had told herself in the years after that she had simply seen clearly what he hadn't wanted to see. That she had been honest about what she needed. That leaving was an act of self-knowledge, not cruelty. She had believed that. She had organized 15 years of identity around believing it. Standing on the aft deck of the Aurora, feeling the engines that belonged to Daniel Carter, working below her feet, she understood that she had not been wrong about what she wanted. She had been wrong about who she was leaving to get it. Richard appeared at the aft deck doorway. She heard him before she saw him. The footsteps she'd learned to recognize over a decade, the specific rhythm of a man in expensive shoes on hardwood. "Hell of a thing," he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. She didn't answer. "Carter of all people." He gave a short, compressed laugh. "I mean, you never said he was into this kind of—" "I didn't know," she said. Richard was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know he owned a—" "I didn't know any of it," she said. "I thought I did. I thought I knew exactly what he was and exactly where he was going." She paused. "I was wrong." Richard didn't like the way she said that. He could hear something in it that had nothing to do with the Aurora and nothing to do with Daniel's bank account, and it was the something that made him feel more displaced than the public correction downstairs had. He could manage business embarrassment. He had managed it before. What he couldn't manage was Victoria looking at the water with that expression, because the expression wasn't about Daniel's success. It was about something else. It was about value. Down in the salon, Daniel's coffee arrived. He thanked the steward by name, Elena, who had been with the vessel for 2 years, and who had just in the kitchen below deck explained to 3 other crew members, in a very few words, why they were going to continue treating every guest on this yacht with complete professionalism tonight, regardless of what had happened on the deck earlier. Because that was what Mr. Carter expected. Because that was what Mr. Carter always expected. Daniel drank the coffee and looked at the presentation documents that Sandra had sent through. The Greystone Capital proposal was serious, a joint acquisition structure that would expand Carter Maritime Group's international reach significantly if the operational framework held up under his analysis. He had questions about 2 specific clauses in the preliminary term sheet. He made notes in the margins. Hal was 3 pages into the analysis when he heard the salon door open. He looked up. Hal Greer. The investor walked into the salon with the unhurried, deliberate movement of a man who has decided something and is now acting on it. He looked at Daniel for a moment, taking in the laptop, the documents, the coffee cup, the simple shirt. "Mind if I sit?" Hal said. Daniel gestured to the seat across the table. Hal sat down. He was a man in his early 60s, with the weathered, organized face of someone who has made enough real decisions to understand the difference between a person who performs success and a person who produces it. He'd been in capital markets for 35 years. He'd seen both kinds up close. He had opinions about which kind was worth his time. "I want to ask you something," Hal said. "And I want you to know I'm asking it straight." "Go ahead," Daniel said. "That situation on the deck." "Wasn't a situation," Daniel said. "Just a misunderstanding." Hal looked at him steadily. "A misunderstanding." "Man thought I was crew," Daniel said. "Happens. To yacht owners. To men in simple shirts on fancy boats." A pause. "It's not the first time." Hal was quiet for a moment. He was assembling something in his mind. Daniel could see it the way you can see a person doing the work of genuine recalibration, rather than just adjusting their performance. "You didn't correct it," Hal said. When Blake handed you the glass, you didn't say anything." "No." "Why not?" Daniel considered the question. He considered it the way he considered things that deserved consideration fully without rushing. "Because it didn't matter," he said. "What he thought didn't change what was true. The yacht was still mine. The inspection was still clean. The meeting was still happening." He looked at Hal. "Correcting him in that moment would have been for my benefit, not for any productive purpose. I don't make business decisions for my benefit." Hal Greer looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Slowly. "Once. I've been in meetings with 1,000 men," Hal said. "You know how many of them would have said what you just said and meant it?" Daniel didn't answer. "3, Hal said. "Maybe 4. He put his hands flat on the table. "I want to talk about the Greystone proposal. The real version. Not the presentation Blake was planning to run." Daniel opened the folder to the page he'd been annotating. "I've got questions about the acquisition clause in Section 4, he said. "So do I," said Hal. They began to talk. On the aft deck, Richard Blake was still talking to Victoria, but the conversation had changed in tone in the way conversations do when one person has gone somewhere internally that the other person can't follow. Victoria was answering in the correct number of syllables, but wasn't fully present in the responses, and Richard, for all his talent at reading rooms, was working too hard on managing his own internal situation to notice. "I was thinking about the investors." He was thinking about Hal Greer's face when the captain had said Daniel's name. He was thinking about Tom Fitch, who had been quiet ever since, and what that quiet meant for a deal that Richard had spent 3 months positioning himself to be part of. I was thinking, though he would not have framed it this way, about how many rooms he had walked into with Daniel Carter's champagne glass, metaphorically in his hand, how many gestures he had made from a position of assumed authority that had not in fact been based on actual authority. I was thinking about whether this was an isolated incident or a pattern, and finding that the honest answer was uncomfortable in ways he wasn't prepared to sit with on a moving yacht surrounded by people he needed to impress. He said none of this to Victoria. She said nothing about the kitchen table. The Aurora moved through dark water, carrying all of them. Daniel with his documents and his coffee. Hal Greer with his 35 years of pattern recognition. Richard with his beautiful watch and his suddenly repositioned standing Victoria with her thread and her railing, and the city disappearing behind her, and the engines ran clean and steady, the way they always did, because Daniel Carter ran things correctly. Even the things nobody knew were his. Especially those. Tom Fitch found the forward lounge unoccupied and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a colleague in Charleston who knew the East Coast maritime investment landscape. He described the situation briefly, mentioned Daniel Carter's name, and listened for 45 seconds to his colleague's response. He hung up. He made the second call to his assistant, who answered on the second ring. "Pull everything we have on Carter Maritime Group," Tom said. "Not the summary, everything." He paused. "No, tonight." He put the phone in his pocket and looked out at the water and thought about what his colleague had just told him about the size of the operation, about the vessels under management, about the Rotterdam office, about the reputation in circles that Tom Fitch had been trying to reach for 3 years, and he understood with the clean, immediate clarity of someone who has been in money long enough to know what the real thing looks like, that he had just been in the same room as someone significantly larger than anyone at this gathering had been led to believe. He also understood something else. He understood that Daniel Carter had known exactly who was on this yacht, and had come anyway, in a simple shirt, with a folder, to look at the inspection report. Tom Fitch went to find the salon. He walked in to find Hal Greer, already there, sitting across from Daniel at the round table, both of them with documents spread between them, talking in the efficient, unpretentious language of men who are actually working. Daniel looked up when Tom entered. He nodded to the third chair. Tom sat. He looked at the documents. He looked at Daniel. He thought about the champagne glass, and the deck, and the laughter. "I want to start over," Tom said. "Forget the presentation. What does Carter Maritime Group actually need from a partnership like this? Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he pushed a page across the table. Read section 4, he said. Then tell me what you think. Tom picked up the page, and that was how the real meeting began. Not with a presentation. Not with a yacht deck and impressed investors and the performance of influence. In a salon around a table with documents and coffee, and two men who had enough experience to recognize something real when they were sitting across from it. Richard Blake knocked on the salon door 20 minutes later. The conversation inside paused. Daniel looked at the door. Then he looked back at the documents. Come in, he said. Richard opened the door. He saw Hal and Tom at the table with Daniel. He saw the documents. He saw the coffee cups. He saw the three men looking at him with three different versions of the same expression. Not hostile, not triumphant, just the neutral, slightly inconvenient look of people who have moved past a moment and are focused on what comes next. Richard stood in the doorway. He looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at him with the same steady, measuring eyes that Victoria had recognized on the dock, the same eyes that had been looking at the world this way since a boy sat on a pier in Beaufort and watched ships come in and decided he was going to be the person who understood how all of it worked. Richard, Daniel said. Daniel. A pause. The word sat differently in Richard's mouth than it had an hour ago. Heavier, more deliberate. I didn't realize. It's fine, Daniel said, simply, without performance. We're working through the Greystone proposal if you want to sit in. Richard stood there for a moment longer. Then he came in. He sat in the remaining chair. He didn't say anything about the glass. Daniel didn't bring it up, because it was already over. Because Daniel Carter had never needed Richard Blake's apology to know his own worth, and he didn't need it now. The meeting was what mattered. The work was what mattered. The outcome was what mattered. Everything else was just weather. The engines ran on beneath them steady and deep, and the water moved past the hull the way it always had, indifferent to the names of the people aboard. Indifferent to the money, and the watches, and the 15 years of assumptions. The yacht knew one name on its paperwork. The rest were just passengers. The meeting had been going for 40 minutes when Richard Blake finally stopped pretending he was following the conversation. He sat at that table surrounded by documents he hadn't read, and numbers he hadn't run, and a vocabulary of operational specifics that Hal Greer and Tom Fitch were using fluently because they had spent the last 40 minutes actually talking to Daniel Carter, the real one, the one behind the simple shirt and the folder, and Richard watched this happen from a distance of about 3 feet, and felt the particular nauseating vertigo of a man who has built his entire sense of standing on a foundation that has just been identified as borrowed. Daniel hadn't looked at him once since he sat down. Not with hostility. Not deliberately. Simply because the conversation didn't require it. The conversation was about Section 4 of the Greystone term sheet, and about the operational framework for a joint acquisition structure covering 6 vessels across 3 international corridors, and Richard Blake had no meaningful contribution to make to any of it, and every person at that table understood this, and nobody said it, and that was somehow worse than if they had. Hal Greer asked Daniel about the Rotterdam operation. Daniel explained it concisely technically, without the decorative language that investors usually apply to make themselves sound more significant than the numbers. He talked about the infrastructure, the crew network, the regulatory relationships he'd spent 4 years building with the Dutch Maritime Authority. He talked about the gap in the Mid-Atlantic corridor that the Greystone partnership could fill if the acquisition clause in Section 4 was restructured to allow for a phased entry rather than a full commitment at signing. Tom Fitch leaned forward while Daniel was talking. He had his pen out. He was writing things down. Richard Blake had his hands in his lap. He was thinking about the champagne glass. He kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, involuntarily, repeatedly, with the same sharp reminder each time. The gesture had felt so natural in the moment, so easy. That was the thing that was gutting him now, in the way that the most honest reckonings always gut you. Not the embarrassment of being wrong, but the clarity of seeing exactly how wrong you were, and understanding that the wrongness wasn't a mistake. It was a habit. It was the automatic, unexamined reflex of a man who had been reading rooms by appearance for so long that he'd forgotten it was a reading strategy rather than a truth. He had looked at Daniel Carter at the truck, at the shirt, at the quiet way. Daniel moved through spaces without announcing himself, and he had constructed a complete story. A finished one. A story with a ceiling on it. And the story had been wrong for 15 years. The question that was burning in Richard's chest right now, the one he absolutely could not ask out loud in this salon on this yacht, was what else have I been wrong about? He didn't stay for the rest of the meeting. He excused himself with a generality. Something about needing air, and Hal Greer nodded without looking up from the document he was reviewing, and Tom Fitch said nothing at all, and Daniel said, "Doors open if you want to come back," in the tone of a man who means it, and also genuinely doesn't care either way. Richard went back to the deck. The night air was cold off the water. The city had fallen fully behind them now, the lights becoming a low decorative glow at the horizon. He stood at the railing and looked at nothing in particular, and tried to organize himself into a shape that felt stable. Victoria was still there. She was sitting on one of the aft deck chairs, her heels off her feet tucked under her, a glass of wine in one hand that she hadn't touched in a while. She looked up when Richard came out. She read his face in the way that a decade of close proximity allows a person to read a face, not with words, but with the immediate wordless comprehension of someone who knows all the registers. She looked back at the water. "How was the meeting?" she asked. Richard put his hands on the railing of someone who knows all the registers. She looked back at the water. "How was the meeting?" she asked. Richard put his hands on the railing. "He's significant," Richard said. It was the only word he could find that was honest without being fully open. "I know," Victoria said. "You knew." "No." She shook her head slowly. "I know now. I should have known before." Richard was quiet for a moment. The engines ran beneath them. The water moved. "He built all of this without telling anyone," Richard said. It came out sounding almost like a question. "That's what he does," Victoria said. "He never needed to tell anyone. That was the part I couldn't understand when I was with him." She paused. "I thought it meant he didn't care about what he was building. I thought if you weren't talking about something, you weren't serious about it." She looked at the glass in her hand. "I had it completely backwards." Richard didn't respond to that. He was smart enough to understand that she wasn't talking to him exactly. She was talking to the version of herself that had sat across a kitchen table from Daniel Carter and said the words that ended a marriage, and she was having the specific private reckoning of a person who has been certain about something for a very long time and has just encountered incontrovertible evidence that the certainty was a costume. Below, deck and the crew mess. Elena Marsh was eating a late dinner and listening to Travis, the junior crew member, who had witnessed the scene on the deck, describe it for the fourth time to two other crew members who hadn't been there. "He just took the glass," Travis said. "Blake handed it to him right in front of everybody. Like Carter was nobody. And Carter just took it. Didn't say a word. Didn't even blink." Elena put her fork down. "Of course he didn't," she said. Travis looked at her. "Why does he do that? If that was my yacht and somebody handed me—" "Because he doesn't need to react," Elena said. "That's what it looks like when a person is actually secure. Not performing security. Actually having it." She picked her fork back up. "I've worked for 3 yacht owners in 12 years. 2 of them would have had that man thrown off the vessel and spent the rest of the night talking about it." Mr. Carter went to look at the inspection report. The table was quiet for a moment. "That's either the most disciplined person I've ever heard of," Travis said, "or the scariest." "In my experience," Elena said, "those are the same thing." Back in the salon. The meeting had reached the point where the architecture of an actual agreement was beginning to take shape. Not a signed document that would require lawyers and time and the full machinery of due diligence. But the shape of a thing. The outline of a real partnership with real terms built on a real conversation between people who were genuinely interested in the substance of what they were discussing. Hal Greer had stopped being careful 40 minutes ago. He was fully present now, the way experienced investors get, when they recognize that the person across from them actually knows what they're talking about, when the jargon falls away and the real conversation begins, and you stop wondering whether you're dealing with someone worth your time. The phased entry structure makes sense for the Mid-Atlantic corridor, Hal said. But what's your timeline on the Rotterdam expansion? Because if we're looking at a Q2 acquisition on the first vessel, we need the European infrastructure to be operational by March, Daniel said. We're 3 weeks out from full certification. I had my operations director in Rotterdam last week. He opened a different section of the folder. Here's the current certification status. Hal looked at the document. He looked at it for a while. You brought this tonight, he said. I bring everything, Daniel said. Hal Greer looked up. He had the expression of a man who is trying to find something amusing to say, and has found instead something true. You knew we'd get here, to this conversation. I thought it was likely, Daniel said. Even with Hal gestured vaguely toward the deck, toward the general vicinity of where Richard Blake had excused himself. Even with all of that. Especially with all of that, Daniel said. The kind of partnership I'm interested in doesn't need a good performance. It needs a good inspection. He paused. Some things get clearer when you stop performing. Hal looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the structural relative of one. The sound of a man who has just had something confirmed that he suspected, but hadn't yet articulated. Tom Fitch was nodding slowly, his pen still moving across his notepad. Outside, the clock had moved past 10. The city lights had shrunk to a thread at the horizon. The Aurora moved through the dark water with the steady, unhurried confidence of a vessel that knows its course, operated by a crew that knows their work, owned by a man who had in the span of a single evening gone from invisible to the only person in this gathering that anyone would remember with any precision. Richard Blake found a chair at the far end of the aft deck and sat in it alone for 22 minutes. He counted them. It was the kind of thing you do when the external options have run out, and you're left with the internal ones, which are considerably less comfortable. He thought about the first time he'd met Victoria. He thought about the early years, the way she had described Daniel when she talked about him, which was rarely and always in the same key. A good man, limited vision, someone who never understood what she needed. Richard had accepted that description, the way you accept inherited furniture, without examining it, without asking whether it was accurate, simply because it was already there when you arrived. He had built his understanding of Daniel Carter on Victoria's account of him. Victoria had built her account on what she'd seen at a particular moment in time. A man who was quiet, who worked constantly, who didn't talk about where he was going because he was too busy actually going there. Richard thought about the glass. He thought about the way Daniel had taken it without a word. I thought about himself in that situation, what he would have done, what he had done in similar situations in his life. The reflexive need to correct the record, to establish the hierarchy, to make sure everyone in the room understood the accurate order of things. He thought about how Daniel had simply walked to the bar, set the glass down, and gone to find the captain. And he thought, though it cost him something to think it, that this was the difference. Not the money, not the yacht, not the scope of what Daniel had built, or the manner in which he'd built it. The difference was something smaller and more fundamental. The difference was that Daniel Carter didn't need the room to know. He just needed to do the work. Richard had been performing success his whole career. Daniel had been producing it. The distinction had not been visible from the outside. That was the problem with it. That was why Richard had been able to maintain his misreading for so long, because the performance, when executed well, looked enough like the real thing that only certain tests could tell them apart. Tonight had been one of those tests. Victoria came over at some point and sat in the chair next to him. She didn't say anything for a while. They sat together in a silence that had a different texture than the ones they usually shared, less comfortable, more honest. The kind of silence that accumulates when two people are each thinking something true that they don't quite know how to give to each other. "Do you think he planned this?" Richard said eventually. "The whole thing, knowing we'd be here." Victoria thought about it. "No," she said. "Daniel doesn't plan for people. He plans for outcomes. There's a difference. With him there is." She paused. "He's not interested in how things look to anyone. He's only interested in whether they work." She looked at her hands. "I used to think that was a limitation. I used to think it meant he didn't care about the right things." She stopped. "And now?" Richard said. She didn't answer right away. The wind moved off the water. The yacht moved through the night. "Now I think," she said carefully, "that I spent a long time confusing the map with the territory." Richard didn't understand exactly what she meant, but he understood enough. He understood the tone of it, which was the tone of a person who has arrived at a truth that reconfigures something, and the reconfiguration is not painless. He reached over and put his hand on hers. She let him. But she was thinking about something else. In the salon, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Sandra from the office sending the updated Rotterdam certification document he'd asked for earlier in the week. He forwarded it to Hal Greer's email with a single line, "Updated cert document arrived tonight." Hal's phone buzzed across the table. He looked at it. He looked at Daniel. "You just came in," Daniel said. Hal opened the document. He read the first page. He passed it to Tom without comment. Tom read it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Carter Maritime Group is fully certified for European operations as of last Tuesday," Tom said finally. "Correct," Daniel said. "And you came to this meeting to determine whether the Greystone partnership was worth pursuing," Daniel said. "I needed to understand who I was dealing with." He looked at Hal, then at Tom. "I think I have a reasonable picture now." Hal Greer sat back in his chair. He had the expression of someone who has just finished a long calculation and arrived at a number he finds surprising but has to respect. "Can I ask you something personal?" Hal said. Daniel waited. "That situation on the deck, Blake and the glass, we all saw it. You let it go, let the whole thing sit there without saying a word." Hal leaned forward. "Why? You could have corrected it immediately. You had every right. And honestly," he paused, "it might have made for a cleaner start to the evening." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "Because the moment I correct something like that," he said slowly, "I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it because my ego is uncomfortable. And my ego's discomfort is not a good reason to make a business decision." He paused. "The truth was going to become apparent regardless. I didn't need to announce it. I just needed to do my job." Hal was quiet. Tom stopped writing. "You knew the captain would make it clear," Tom said. It wasn't quite a question. "The captain was going to do his job," Daniel said. "His job required him to communicate with the vessel owner. That would have happened whether Richard was on this yacht or not." He shrugged the genuine shrug of someone for whom this is simply a sequence of logical events. "I didn't engineer anything. I just didn't interrupt it." Hal Greer looked at Tom Fitch. Tom Fitch looked at Hal Greer. Something passed between them that had the quality of a decision being made, not discussed, not debated, just arrived at in the way decisions get made between experienced people who have developed the shorthand of long professional trust. "We want to pursue this," Hal said. "Seriously, not the Greystone presentation. This." He gestured at the documents between them. "The real version." Daniel looked at the document in front of him. He looked at the Rotterdam certification on Hal's phone screen. He looked at Section 4, which he'd annotated with 3 specific restructuring proposals that would make the phased entry actually workable. "I'll have my operations director send a full proposal by Friday," he said. "Review it over the weekend. If it makes sense to you on Monday, we'll set up a formal meeting with council." Friday, and Hal confirmed. "Friday," Daniel said. They shook hands across the table. Tom Fitch was already texting his assistant to block the following week. In the 90 minutes that it took the Aurora to complete its route and return to the harbor, 3 things happened aboard the vessel that nobody would fully piece together until afterward. The first was that Hal Greer made a phone call to a colleague in New York, a fund manager named Cortez who operated in the international maritime investment space and whose name Daniel recognized without having met him, and said 4 sentences. "Carter Maritime Group, Daniel Carter. Look him up tonight. I'll explain tomorrow." Then he hung up. The second was that Tom Fitch, standing at the bow of the yacht, watching the city lights grow back toward their full size, called the same colleague in Charleston he'd called an hour earlier and said, "Everything you told me, double it. and find out who his legal counsel is. The third was that Richard Blake, alone at the aft railing, while Victoria had gone inside to find a restroom, took out his phone and searched Daniel Carter's name. He stood at the railing of a $40 million yacht and read about the man he'd handed a champagne glass to and the information that came back. The vessels, the offices, the industry citations, the size of the operation. The 15 years of quiet compounding disciplined growth landed on him with the specific weight of something that cannot be unlanded. He put the phone away. He gripped the railing with both hands and looked at the approaching harbor and did something that Richard Blake had very rarely done in his adult life. He took full, accurate stock of himself, not the performing version. Not the version that showed up in rooms and talked about access and connections and the exciting opportunities he was positioned to be part of. The actual version. The man behind the watch. The man who had looked at Daniel Carter on this deck and seen someone beneath him and had been not just wrong, but comprehensively, revealingly, categorically wrong. And the worst part, the part that sat in his stomach like something swallowed wrong, was that it wasn't malice. He hadn't looked at Daniel and thought, I want to humiliate this person. He had looked at Daniel and genuinely, automatically, without any examination whatsoever, placed him. Filed him, categorized him by what he wore and how he moved and what he drove. He had been so certain. He was always so certain. That was the pattern Richard had to sit with. Not just tonight, not just Daniel. The pattern. How many rooms had he walked into with the same certainty? How many people had he placed in his mental hierarchy of relevance based on the same shallow signals? And how often had the placement been accurate? And how often had it been this? The harbor was close now. The crew was moving with the quiet efficiency of people preparing for docking, executing practiced routines that required no direction because the operation was well run. Because the owner ran things correctly. Victoria reappeared at the aft deck doorway. She looked at Richard at the railing. She looked at his hands, which were still gripping it. She walked over and stood beside him. You looked him up, she said. Not a question. Yeah, Richard said. She nodded. I looked him up 2 years ago, she said quietly. I found one trade publication mention. A maritime consulting firm in Charleston. I thought that's good for him. He found something. She stopped. I didn't look any further. Because you thought you already knew, Richard said. Because I thought I already knew, she agreed. The lights of the harbor were close enough now that their reflections were breaking on the water below the railing. The city coming back. The evening ending. All the versions of themselves they'd walked onto this yacht with Richard, the connected businessman, Victoria, the woman who had made the right choice. The two of them building a life that was supposed to confirm what they believed about their own judgment. All of those versions were going to have to step off this vessel in a few minutes and figure out who they were going to be now. Daniel appeared at the salon doorway. He had his folder under his arm, his laptop bag over his shoulder. He looked at the approaching harbor with the practical assessment of a man, calculating timing, docking, parking, the drive home, the call he needed to make to Sandra in the morning. He looked at Richard and Victoria at the railing. He didn't look away. Victoria turned and saw him. Their eyes met across the deck, and something happened in that look that wasn't anger, and wasn't satisfaction, and wasn't forgiveness, because it was too early for that, and maybe too complicated for any of those categories. It was something quieter. The look of two people who share a history that doesn't fit into any of the neat filing categories that life usually provides. The look of people who have become strangers through specific choices and specific silences, and the slow accumulation of time moving in different directions. Daniel nodded to her. Just that. She nodded back. Richard looked between them and said nothing because there was nothing accurate to say. And for once, Richard Blake understood that the nothing was the correct choice. The Aurora came into her berth with the smooth, unhurried precision of a vessel returning home. The crew handled the lines. The engines dropped to a low rumble, then to silence. The gangway went down. The guests began to move toward the exit. Some of them stopped to speak to Daniel as they passed brief conversations, the exchange of cards, the language of people who want to remain in contact with someone they have identified as worth knowing. Daniel shook hands, said the right things, in the right register, committed to nothing specific beyond what was already on the table with Hal and Tom. He was the last owner off his own vessel. He stood at the top of the gangway and looked back at the Aurora, at the clean lines of her, the running lights, the crew beginning the closeout procedures that would secure her properly for the night, and he felt something that was not pride exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. Satisfaction, maybe. The specific satisfaction of a thing working the way it was designed to work. He walked down the gangway. He walked to the public parking lot. He got in his truck. He drove home, in the car behind him, leaving the marina. At the same time, Richard Blake sat in the passenger seat while his driver navigated the harbor road, and he looked out the window at the truck's taillights moving ahead of them, and he thought about a word. Value. Not success. Not money. Not the size of the operation or the name on the vessel papers. Value. What a person is actually worth. Independent of what they're wearing. Independent of who's watching. Independent of whether anyone around them has correctly identified it yet. He had looked at Daniel Carter and seen no value. The value had been there the entire time. The truck's taillights turned left at the harbor exit and disappeared into the city. Richard Blake looked at the empty road. Victoria beside him was looking at her phone. She had one contact open. The name at the top of the screen was Daniel Carter. She hadn't called it. She hadn't texted it. She was looking at the number that she had kept in her phone for 15 years without fully knowing why she'd kept it, and she was thinking about a question she wasn't ready to ask yet, but understood she would eventually need to. She put the phone in her bag. The driver navigated them through the harbor district. The city moved around them. The night continued. And on. The Aurora, still in her berth, Captain Reeves walked the final check of the vessel before signing off. Checking the lines, checking the crew log, checking the fuel report, checking everything. The way you check things when the person who depends on you doing it correctly is someone who will actually notice if you don't. He paused at the salon doorway. The table where Daniel had sat with the investors still had the papers on it. The Greystone proposal, the Rotterdam certification, the annotated Section 4, with Daniel's margin notes in his careful, angular handwriting. The captain stood in the doorway and looked at those papers. He thought about a man who had come aboard his own vessel and been handed an empty glass by a guest who had no idea who he was talking to. He thought about what Daniel had done with that moment. He shook his head slowly. Not in judgment. In something closer to recognition, the recognition of someone who has worked with a person long enough to understand that what you just witnessed was not unusual. That this was how the man operated. That the restraint and the focus and the absolute absence of the need for acknowledgement were not strategies deployed for the occasion. They were just who Daniel Carter was. The captain turned off the salon light. He continued his rounds. Outside the harbor was quiet, and the water held the reflections of the city lights. The way water holds everything temporarily faithfully, without judgment. Ready to show you exactly what is there, whether you're looking or not. Sandra Cho got to the office at 7:15 the next morning and found Daniel already there. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the coffee. He had made 2 cups, one for himself, one sitting on her desk, waiting for her, which meant he had known she would come in early, which meant he had called ahead, which meant something significant had happened the night before that he hadn't told her yet. She sat down. She picked up the coffee. She looked at him through the glass wall of his office where he was on the phone standing at the window with his back to her, looking at the harbor, the way he always looked at it like he was reading it. She waited. He finished the call. He came to the doorway. Rotterdam proposal, he said. Hal Greer and Tom Fitch. I need the full package on their desks by Friday morning, not the standard overview. The operational breakdown, the certification documents, the 5-year corridor projection. He paused. And the vessel acquisition analysis, Sandra. The real one, not the summary. Sandra had her pen out. How'd the gathering go? She asked. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Interesting, he said. She waited for more. More did not come. She wrote down what he'd said and went to work because in 7 years she had learned that when Daniel Carter said interesting in that particular register, it meant something significant had occurred, and he had already processed it and moved on, and her job was to make sure the work that followed was ready when he needed it. She also, because she was Sandra Cho, and she was very good at her job, searched Hal Greer and Tom Fitch while she was pulling the Rotterdam files. She looked at their fund structures. She looked at their recent acquisition history. She looked at the portfolio size and the international reach and the specific areas where their capital was positioned. She looked at all of that for about 4 minutes. Then she stood up, walked to Daniel's doorway and said, "How serious?" Daniel looked up from his desk. "Very," he said. She went back to her desk and canceled 2 of her afternoon calls. Across the city, at approximately 7:45 in the morning, Richard Blake was sitting at the kitchen island of the home he shared with Victoria, drinking coffee he hadn't tasted, staring at his phone. He had been up since 5. Victoria had slept or had appeared to sleep, which with Victoria was sometimes the same thing. He had lain beside her in the dark for 2 hours, listening to the specific quality of silence that a house produces when the people in it are both awake and not talking. And then he had gotten up and come downstairs and made coffee, and sat with the events of the previous evening arranged around him like furniture he needed to figure out how to live with. He had looked at Daniel's company again in the night. More carefully this time. He had found the trade publication profiles, not many, because Daniel apparently did not seek them out, and the industry association citations, and a single interview from 4 years ago in a maritime logistics journal that Daniel had given at what appeared to be a conference in which he had answered questions about operational efficiency in private vessel management with the specific undecorated precision of someone who had thought carefully about these things for a long time and didn't need to be interesting about it because the content was interesting enough. Richard had read the interview 3 times. He had been looking for something in it, some flash of the personality that he would have expected, some hunger for recognition, some performance of expertise, some evidence of the ego that Richard had assumed must be present beneath the quiet exterior, because in Richard's experience, men who built things always wanted you to know they'd built them. There was nothing like that in the interview. Daniel talked about systems, about efficiency, about the way a well-designed operation removes the need for heroics, because everyone knows their role and the role is correctly designed. He talked about crew culture and how the tone of an operation comes entirely from the person at the top and filters down through every level, and how you can tell within 20 minutes of boarding a vessel whether the owner is actually engaged or just financially present. Richard read that line 4 times. He put the phone face down on the counter. He drank his coffee. Victoria came downstairs at 8. She was dressed already, which meant she had made a decision about something, because Victoria only got dressed quickly when she'd resolved something in her mind and was moving toward it. She poured her own coffee. She sat across from him at the island. They looked at each other. "I'm going to call him," she said. Richard felt something shift in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, something more complicated than that. Something that recognized the significance of the statement and understood correctly that it was not about romance. It was about something older and heavier. "Okay," he said. "I owe him an apology," she said. "A real one. Not for the yacht or for last night. For things that happened a long time ago that I never went back and named correctly." Richard looked at his coffee cup. "What did you name them incorrectly as?" he asked. Victoria thought about it for a moment. "I called them incompatibility," she said. "I called them different visions. I said we wanted different things." She paused. "But what I was actually saying was that I didn't believe in what he was doing. I didn't believe he had the capacity to build something worth staying for." She looked up at Richard. "That's different. That's not incompatibility. That's a failure of perception." Richard absorbed this. He was a man who could, when sufficiently motivated, be honest. Last night had been sufficient motivation. "Is that what you thought about me?" he asked. "When you came to me? Was it partly that I looked like proof that you'd been right to leave? Like I was evidence for the story?" Victoria looked at him steadily. She didn't answer for a long time. When she did, it was simply, "I don't know, maybe." Richard nodded, slowly. He picked up his coffee. He put it down. "I think you should call him," he said. She called at 9:15. Daniel was in the middle of reviewing the Rotterdam proposal draft when his cell phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The name there was one he hadn't seen in 2 years. She'd texted him twice in that period, both times about Lily, both times brief and transactional. He answered on the third ring. Victoria. Daniel. A pause. I know you're working. I'll be quick. I've got a few minutes, he said. He leaned back in his chair. She said, I want to apologize. He waited. Not for last night. Last night was just something that happened. I want to apologize for things I should have said a long time ago and didn't. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the effort in the steadiness. I didn't believe in you. When we were together, I didn't believe in what you were capable of. And I told myself that was honesty, that I was being realistic. But it wasn't honesty. It was... She stopped. It was a failure of judgment, my judgment. And I want you to know I understand that now. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the harbor moved with its ordinary morning traffic vessels coming and going. The machinery of a functioning port, doing what it always did, indifferent to the particular conversation happening in the office above it. Victoria, he said. I know you don't need this, she said quickly. I know it doesn't change anything for you. I just needed to say it. I appreciate that, he said. I do. A pause. For what it's worth, I don't think you were wrong about everything. We did want different things. That part was true. But you built them anyway, she said. The things you wanted. You did it without needing anyone to watch. I did it for Lily, he said simply. That was always the whole point. Victoria was quiet. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say. She's incredible, Daniel. She's so much of you. He felt something move in his chest. The thing that always moved when someone named Lily accurately, when someone saw her the way she deserved to be seen. Yeah, he said. She is. They stayed on the phone for another moment in a silence that had changed texture from the beginning of the call, less heavy, more honest. The silence of two people who have said the thing that needed saying and are now in the afterword of it. Thank you for calling, Daniel said. Thank you for answering, she said. He ended the call. He sat for 30 seconds without moving, looking at the harbor. Then he opened the Rotterdam proposal and went back to work. The call between Daniel and Sandra that morning generated 3 separate lines of work that ran simultaneously through the Carter Maritime Group offices for the next 48 hours with the quiet, organized intensity of an operation that knows how to move without making noise about it. Marcus Webb, who had been Daniel's first hire and was now the company's chief operations officer, pulled the 5-year corridor projection from the analysis database and began updating it with the Q3 figures that had come in from Rotterdam the previous week. 2 financial analysts spent Thursday building the acquisition cost model for the specific vessel class that the Greystone partnership would require. Sandra coordinated all of it from her desk with the systematic efficiency of someone who had spent 7 years learning exactly how Daniel Carter's mind organized a problem and could now anticipate the next step before he named it. Daniel moved through all of it with his characteristic unhurried focus, reviewing, questioning, correcting, approving. He asked Marcus 3 times to verify a specific fuel consumption figure that didn't match his expectation for that vessel class. The 3rd time, Marcus came back with an explanation. Daniel listened, asked 2 follow-up questions, and then said, "All right, put it in the footnote with the source." Not because he didn't trust Marcus. Because Hal Greer was the kind of investor who would find the footnote and check the source, and Daniel wanted him to find it clean. That was how he had always worked. The details existed whether or not anyone checked them. But when someone did check them, they needed to hold. Thursday afternoon at 2:47. Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen. A number he recognized but hadn't spoken to in some time. A private equity attorney named Warren Shields, who worked out of New York and occupied the specific niche of maritime investment law that made him relevant to exactly the kind of partnership Daniel was structuring with Hal and Tom. He answered. Warren. Daniel. The voice on the other end had the particular texture of a New York attorney who has been in serious rooms for 30 years, direct, dry, precise. I heard you had an interesting evening aboard the Aurora. Daniel said nothing. Hal Greer called me this morning, Warren said. At 7. He almost never calls before 9. Said I needed to make myself available for a transaction he's developing and that the counterparty was Carter Maritime Group. A pause. He also said, and I'm quoting, because it was memorable that you were the most composed person he'd ever watched, get handed an empty glass by a man who didn't know who he was talking to. It was a champagne flute, Daniel said. Warren made the sound of someone trying not to laugh at something they find genuinely funny. Are you available Monday? Warren said. In person, New York. Hal wants to move quickly on this. He said again, quoting that he spent 35 years looking for someone who does the work instead of the performance, and he doesn't want to wait 3 months while lawyers correspond by email. I can be in New York Monday, Daniel said. I'll bring Sandra and Marcus. Good. Warren paused. One more thing. Tom Fitch separately called my associate this morning. He wants to know if Carter Maritime Group would consider a separate advisory arrangement independent of the Greystone structure. Something ongoing. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Tell Tom I'll discuss it in New York, he said. Same meeting. Done, Warren said. He ended the call. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand. I thought about 15 years. About the garage in Savannah, where he'd built the first version of a company that was about to sit across from 35 years of New York private equity in a Monday morning meeting. About the truck in the parking lot, and the simple shirt, and the empty glass, and the specific look on Richard Blake's face when the captain said his name. He thought about Lily. He picked up the phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, which meant she wasn't in class. Dad, what's up? You never call on Thursdays. Something happened, he said. I wanted to tell you about it. A pause. When Lily paused, it had a particular quality, not hesitation, but attention. She focused the way Daniel focused completely and immediately. She'd been doing it since she was 3 years old. Tell me, she said, he told her. Not all of it. Not the emotional architecture. Not Victoria. Not the parts that were still settling in him. But the business of it. The partnership, the meeting in the salon, the Monday trip to New York. The shape of what was coming. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Hal Greer, she said. I know that fund. We studied it in my capital markets class last semester. I know you did, Daniel said. That's partly why I'm calling. Another pause. Dad, are you nervous? The question surprised him. Not because it was wrong, but because of who was asking it. His daughter, 21 years old, and sharp as an instrument, asking him with the direct, uncomplicated care of someone who wants an accurate answer and not a performance. No, he said. Really, really. He thought about it. I'm not nervous because I know the work is right. The only time I'm nervous in a meeting is when I'm not certain about the foundation. The foundation here is solid. And the other stuff, Lily said. The yacht stuff. You're not going to tell me, are you? It wasn't a question. Not on the phone, he said. Okay, she said. Sunday dinner. I'll drive down. I'll make the pasta, he said. The good pasta, she said. Not the jar. The good pasta, he agreed. She laughed her real laugh, the one that had been making rooms feel better since she was small, and told him she was proud of him, and the way she said it was the way adults say it to each other when they mean it, and aren't performing it for anyone. He drove home that evening, the way he always drove home in the truck, in his own company, processing the day. The way a person processes something real, not by talking about it, but by sitting with it until it settled into something he understood. The Friday package went to Hal Greer's email at 8:47 in the morning. 112 pages. Fully sourced. Every figure in a footnote. The Rotterdam certification attached. The 5-year corridor projection, built on conservative assumptions, with the aggressive scenario modeled separately and labeled clearly as such. Hal Greer opened it at 9:15. Daniel knew this because Hal's assistant called Sandra at 9:22 to confirm receipt and to ask whether Daniel's team would be available for a preliminary call Monday morning before the in-person meeting. Sandra knocked on Daniel's doorway. They want a preliminary call Monday morning, she said. Tell them the preliminary call is the meeting, Daniel said. Tell them to bring the questions they have after reading the package and we'll work through them in the room. Sandra relayed this. Hal Greer's assistant called back 8 minutes later. Mr. Greer says that's the right answer, the assistant said. He'll see you Monday. Richard Blake called Daniel at 11:15 on Friday morning. Daniel looked at the number. He hadn't expected this call. He considered it for a moment, not whether to answer, but what register to answer in, because the register mattered, and he wanted to choose it correctly before he picked up. He answered. Richard. Daniel, I know you're busy. 2 minutes. Go ahead. A pause. I want to apologize for what happened on the yacht. The glass, the comment on the deck, all of it. Richard's voice had none of its usual performance in it. It was stripped down, which was either genuine or a better performance than usual. And Daniel understood he might not be able to tell the difference immediately, and that this was fine. I was wrong. I made assumptions that they were wrong. And I said things in front of people that were, another pause, that were beneath the situation and beneath you. Daniel listened. I appreciate that, he said. I also want to say. Richard stopped. Restarted. What you've built, Carter Maritime Group, all of it. It's significant, Daniel. And I had no idea, and I should have. You didn't know, Daniel said. That's not an obligation. I made it worse than not knowing, Richard said. I assumed I knew. That's different. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It is different. The acknowledgement landed between them without being weaponized, which was, Daniel knew the correct thing to do with an honest apology. You received it. You didn't use it. Is there anything I can do? Richard said. Professionally. I have some connections in the... No, Daniel said. Simply, without hostility. But thank you. Another pause. Is Lily okay? Richard said. The question came out differently from the rest, quieter, more careful, less strategic. Lily's great, Daniel said. And then, because the question had been genuine, she's coming down Sunday. We're having dinner. Good, Richard said. That's good. He seemed to mean it. She's a good kid. She's a great kid, Daniel said. She always was. The call ended shortly after that. Daniel sat with the phone on his desk. He thought about Richard's voice on that call, the stripped-down version, the one without the watch and the suit and the position. He thought about what it costs a man like Richard to make a call like that, and whether the cost was genuine or calculated, and decided that it didn't actually matter which, because the call itself had been the right thing to do, and doing the right thing for complicated reasons was still doing the right thing. He went back to work. Sunday evening. Lily arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine she'd selected herself, a Côte du Rhône she'd read about and wanted to try, which was so thoroughly her father's daughter that Daniel had to suppress a smile when she handed it to him, and they made dinner together in the kitchen of his house, the way they had made it 1,000 times, with music playing low on the counter speaker and the practiced shorthand of two people who know each other's rhythms in a shared space. He told her about the aurora over dinner. All of it this time. Victoria, Richard, the glass, the captain, the salon, Hal and Tom. The way the evening had reorganized itself around a single moment that nobody had engineered, but that had revealed something true about everyone present. Lily listened the way she always listened, completely, with both the analytical side and the human side running simultaneously, neither one overriding the other. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about Mom?" she said. Not aggressively, with the directness of someone who trusts the person they're asking enough to ask the real question. Daniel looked at his wine glass. "I feel like she made choices that were honest for where she was," he said carefully. "And that where she was didn't have a full picture of where things were going. That's not a crime. That's just being a person. People don't always see what's coming." "Are you angry?" Lily said. "No," he said. And it was true. "I was for a while, early on. But the anger takes energy, and I needed the energy for other things, so I put it down." Lily looked at him. "You make it sound easy," she said. "It wasn't easy," he said. "It was a decision. Those are different things." She nodded. She turned her wine glass in her hands. She said, "She called me, this week, Mom. She wanted to know if we were okay. If you and I were, if I was upset about what happened." Daniel looked at her. "What did you tell her?" "I told her we were fine," Lily said. "I told her you'd never been anything other than fine from my perspective, because you always made sure I was the most important thing in the room." She paused. And then she got quiet. And then she said, "I know he did." And she sounded, "I don't know. Sad, I guess. But not the bad kind of sad." Daniel absorbed this. "The understanding kind," he said. "Yeah," Lily said. "The understanding kind." They finished dinner. They washed the dishes the way they always washed them. Daniel washing Lily, drawing the same division of labor they'd established when she was 9 years old, and it had simply never changed because neither of them had ever seen a reason to change it. "Are you going to be okay?" Lily said at some point during the dishes. She was drying a glass and looking at him sideways the way she asked the things she actually needed the answer to. "I'm already okay," he said. "I've been okay for a long time." "I know," she said. "But this week it was a lot of old stuff coming back." He handed her the next glass. "It's good when old things come back," he said. "Sometimes, because they come back with the distance on them. You can see them for what they were, not for what they felt like when they were happening." She dried the glass. "What were they?" she said. "The old things. What do they look like now with the distance?" He thought about it for a moment. "They look like a man who was building something," he said, "and didn't know yet how big it would get. And people who looked at the building and couldn't see the finished shape." He rinsed the last bowl. "That's not their fault. It wasn't finished yet." Lily put the dried glass in the cabinet. She turned and looked at her father, at the simple shirt, the graying at the temples, the hands that had handled inspection reports and contract documents, and her homework, and her nightmares, and every practical thing that love could be turned into, and she felt something that was too large and too specific to have a simple name. "I'm glad you're my dad," she said. He looked at her. He said, "That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me." She threw the dish towel at him. He caught it. They both laughed. And in a harbor not far from that kitchen, the Aurora sat in her berth under the night skylines. Secure crew, resting engines, quiet hull, carrying the weight of salt water and the unremarkable fact of being exactly what she was, a vessel that belonged to a man in a simple shirt who made dinner on Sunday evenings and drove an ordinary truck and had never once needed the room to understand what he was worth. Monday was coming. The work was ready. Daniel Carter slept well that night, the way a man sleeps when his foundation holds, and his daughter is safe, and the thing he built is true. It was enough. It had always been enough. The rest was just arriving on schedule. The Monday morning meeting in New York started at 9 o'clock sharp. Daniel was there at 8:40, not to impress anyone, not to establish dominance through early arrival. He was there because the conference room at Warren Shields' firm had a whiteboard, and he had 3 structural questions about the Greystone acquisition clause that he wanted to map out before the room filled up and the energy shifted from thinking to performing. He asked the receptionist for a marker. She gave him 2. He stood at the whiteboard in his regular clothes, gray shirt, dark slacks, the same leather folder he'd carried onto the Aurora, and worked through the clause structure the way he worked through everything quietly, completely, until it made sense. Warren arrived at 8:50 and stopped in the doorway of the conference room. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Daniel. He had been a maritime attorney for 31 years, and he had been in a lot of Monday morning meetings, and he stood there for a specific moment that his assistant coming in behind him would later describe to a colleague as the look Warren gets when he realizes he's in the room with someone serious. "Morning," Daniel said without turning around. "You mapped the entire clause structure," Warren said. 3 problems in the current language," Daniel said. "I want Hal to see them before we start negotiating solutions, because if he sees the problems himself, he'll trust the solutions more." Warren set his briefcase down. "That," he said, "is either the most strategically intelligent thing I've heard in a Monday morning, or you've been up since 4. "Both," Daniel said. Warren almost smiled. He sat down, opened his briefcase, and got to work. Hal Greer and Tom Fitch arrived at 8:58 together, which meant they'd met beforehand and were arriving with a shared position already formed. Daniel noted this without reacting to it. It was smart. It was what he would have done. Hal saw the whiteboard the moment he walked in. He stopped. He read what was on it. He looked at Daniel. "You found the clause problems," he said. "3 of them," Daniel said. "They're not deal breakers. They're just imprecise, and imprecision in acquisition language costs money later." Tom Fitch was already beside the whiteboard reading. He turned to Hal. "He's right. The third one, especially that ambiguity, would have created a conflict at the first vessel transfer." Hal looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Daniel. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "All right," he said. "Let's fix them." The meeting ran for 4 hours. Not 4 hours of presentations. Not 4 hours of people performing confidence at each other across a glossy table. 4 hours of actual work, the kind where people disagree and then work through the disagreement and come out with something better on the other side, where somebody says, "I don't understand this number," and the response is honest rather than defensive, where the thing that's being built in the room is real rather than theatrical. Sandra and Marcus had come up from Charleston the night before. Sandra handled the documentation with the systematic precision that had kept Daniel's operation clean for 7 years. Marcus answered technical questions about the Rotterdam infrastructure with the grounded authority of someone who had personally walked that facility the previous week. Daniel sat at the center of it and ran the room the way he ran everything, not loudly, not with the performed authority of someone who needs the room to feel his presence, but with the quiet orienting force of a person who knows the most about what they're discussing and is using that knowledge to move things forward rather than to establish status. At one point, Tom Fitch's co-investor, a man named Gerald Park, who had flown in from Chicago and who had not been at the Aurora and therefore had no pre-existing image of Daniel to reorganize, leaned over to Warren Shields during a brief recess and said in a low voice, "Where has this guy been?" Warren, pouring coffee, said without looking up, "Exactly where he's always been. Just not where people like us were looking." Gerald absorbed this. I went back to his seat and read Section 4 of the proposal for the second time. The agreement they reached by 1 o'clock was not the agreement anyone had arrived expecting to sign. It was better. It was structured around Daniel's phased entry model, with the acquisition clause, rewritten in language that Warren said, with the satisfied exactness of a man whose job is precision, was the cleanest acquisition framework he'd drafted in 5 years. The partnership structure gave Carter Maritime Group the operational authority it needed to run the corridor assets correctly, and gave Greystone Capital the investment exposure Hal and Tom were looking for, without either party carrying risk that belonged to the other. They shook hands at 1:15. Tom Fitch held Daniel's hand for a moment longer than a standard handshake. "I want to say something," Tom said. The room was still. Warren had his pen down. Sandra had her notepad closed. Hal was watching. "I've been in this business for 28 years, Tom said. "I've sat across from a lot of people who were very good at telling me why they were worth investing in." He paused. "You're the first person in a long time who let the work make the argument." Daniel looked at him. "The work is the argument," Daniel said. "Everything else is just noise." Tom nodded. They let go. The news moved through the maritime investment community, the way real news always moves, not through press releases or announcements, but through the specific accelerated whisper network of people who talk to other people who talk to other people. And within 72 hours of the Monday signing, Daniel's phone had received calls from 4 parties he'd been in preliminary conversations with for years, who were suddenly prepared to move from preliminary to serious. He returned every call personally. He returned them from the truck, from his office, from the kitchen, while making dinner. He didn't have an assistant handle his calls. He hadn't had one handle his calls in 15 years because he believed, and the belief had proven itself correct enough times to be treated as principle, that the person you speak to when you call a company tells you something fundamental about how that company is run. Sandra told him on Wednesday that 3 maritime trade publications had requested interviews. "Which ones?" he said. She named them. He thought about it for exactly the length of time it deserved. "The industry one," he said. "Not the others." Why not the others? Because the others want the story, he said. The industry one wants the work. I'll talk about the work. She scheduled it for the following Thursday. He spent 20 minutes preparing for it, which was the amount of time required to organize the 3 things he actually wanted to say, and then he went and said them clearly and went back to his desk. The article ran 2 weeks later under a headline that was less dramatic than what the other publications would have written, but more accurate: Carter Maritime Group closes. Greystone Partnership in Restructured Acquisition Framework. Industry people read it and understood what it meant. That was the audience it was written for. That was the only audience Daniel Carter had ever written for. Lily called him the morning the article ran. "Dad," she said, "it's in 3 of my professors' inboxes. One of them emailed the class." He was quiet. "Are you embarrassed?" she said, and he could hear the smile in it. "No," he said. "Are you?" "I'm the opposite of embarrassed," she said. "I'm using it as a case study for my capital markets paper." He laughed his real laugh, which was rare and therefore recognizable to anyone who knew him, a sound that came from somewhere unguarded. "Don't do that." "I'm absolutely doing that," she said. "You're going in the methodology section." Lily. "Dad, you restructured a phased acquisition clause in an international maritime partnership. That's literally what my class is about." He said nothing. "You're going in the methodology section," she said again firmly, with the particular authority of a 21-year-old who has inherited her father's stubbornness and has not yet had sufficient years to fully manage it. Fine, he said. She hung up satisfied. He sat with the phone in his hand and felt something that was too quiet to call happiness, but was in the same family. The specific grounded warmth of a man whose life is producing what he built it to produce. Not the dramatic version. Not the version with the yacht deck and the stunned investors and the captain saying his name. The real version. His daughter using his work as a case study. Sandra scheduling an interview he would spend 20 minutes preparing for. Marcus sending the updated Rotterdam timeline from his desk in Charleston. This was it. This was the whole thing. Everything else was just the echo of it. The twist that nobody saw coming. Not Hal, not Tom, not Warren, not even Sandra arrived on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the New York meeting, in the form of a call from a number Daniel didn't immediately recognize. He answered anyway. "Mr. Carter." The voice was female formal, with the specific cadence of someone reading from a prepared context. "My name is Catherine Reyes. I'm calling on behalf of Greystone Capital's International Division. We have a situation that requires your direct attention." Daniel set down the document he'd been reviewing. "Go ahead," he said. "The Aurora," Catherine said. "We've been contacted by a party interested in acquiring her. The offer is significant. However, given the timing, the partnership agreement was signed 6 weeks ago, and the Aurora is listed as a reference asset in the operational framework. Mr. Greer felt you should be part of this conversation before any response is given." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Who's the buyer?" he said. A pause. "That's the complicating factor," Catherine said. "The inquiry came through an intermediary. The beneficial owner of the purchasing entity is listed as Blake Capital Holdings." The name landed in the silence of Daniel's office like something dropped from a height. He looked at the harbor through his window. Richard Blake was trying to buy the Aurora. He sat with this information for the 20 seconds it required to fully process, not the emotional content of it, which was secondary, but the operational content. The implications for the partnership structure. The timing. The question of why. Then he picked up the phone and called Hal Greer directly. Hal answered on the second ring. "You got Catherine's call?" "I did," Daniel said. "Did you know?" "Not until this morning," Hal said. "The inquiry came through a London intermediary. We didn't connect it to Blake until the compliance check ran the beneficial ownership." A pause. "What do you want to do?" "I want to understand the offer first," Daniel said. "What's the number?" Hal named it. Daniel didn't react outwardly. The number was significant. The number was in the clinical language of asset valuation, above market, for a vessel of the Aurora's specifications and age, which meant Richard was paying a premium, which meant this was not a purely financial decision. He wants the yacht, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. He wants something, Hal said. Daniel thought about Richard Blake, standing at the aft railing on the night of the gathering, hands gripping the rail, looking at the city disappearing behind the vessel. He thought about the phone call Richard had made on Friday, the stripped-down voice, the genuine apology, the question about Lily. He thought about a man who had spent an evening understanding something painful about himself, and was now making a financial gesture in the direction of the thing that had shown it to him. He thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean. "I'm not selling," Daniel said. Hal was quiet for a moment. "The number is above market." "I know what the number is," Daniel said. "The Aurora isn't a financial asset to me. She's an operational asset. She's part of how I run the business. I don't sell things that work." Another pause. "Is there any part of this that's personal?" Hal said. He asked it the way a serious person asks a serious question, directly, without apology for the directness, because the directness is respect. Daniel thought about it honestly. "There might be a part of it that's personal to Richard," he said. "I don't think he's a bad man. I think he had a bad night, and he's trying to do something with what he learned. But that's not a sufficient reason for me to restructure a business asset." He paused. "Decline the offer professionally. No explanation beyond the vessel not being available." "Done," Hal said. "And Carter, for what it's worth, that's the right answer." "I know," Daniel said. He ended the call. He sat for a moment. Then he picked up the phone again and called Richard Blake. Richard answered too quickly, which meant he'd been expecting the call, which meant he'd known the offer would reach Daniel and had made it anyway. Whether that was boldness or something else, Daniel hadn't decided yet. "Daniel," Richard said. "Richard." A beat. "The Aurora's not for sale." A silence. "I figured," Richard said. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man who had made a gesture knowing it might not land, and had made it anyway, because the making of it was the point, not the outcome. "Why'd you try?" Daniel said. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to do something," he said. I know it doesn't make business sense, but after everything that happened, I felt like I needed to—" He stopped. "I don't know. Make something right. Even if the making of it was just the attempt." Daniel listened to this. He heard the honesty in it. He heard the imprecision in it too, the way people are imprecise when they're being genuine, rather than strategic, because strategy produces clean sentences, and honesty produces the messy kind. "Richard," he said, "you don't have to buy anything to make something right." Silence on the other end. "The apology you called with last week," Daniel said. "That was enough. That was the real thing. This," he paused. "This was trying to use money to finish a sentence that words already finished." Richard didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after something has been correctly named. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right. Find something worth building," Daniel said. "Something real. Don't spend your energy trying to acquire things that represent other people's work. Build your own." Another silence. "That's good advice," Richard said. "It's the only advice I have," Daniel said. "It's the same advice I've been following for 20 years. They said goodbye without ceremony. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand resolution between two men who had stood on opposite ends of too many things. But there was something that mattered more than drama. There was an accurate accounting. Two men who had seen each other clearly finally, and had said what needed saying, and were now free to go back to their separate lives with the particular lightness of people who have put down something heavy. Daniel hung up. He looked at the harbor for a long moment. I thought about the garage in Savannah. He thought about Pete Garrison's operations report spread across his kitchen table at midnight while Lily slept down the hall. He thought about Marcus at 24, walking into a small office above a shipping supply store with his diploma still damp from the ceremony, trusting that Daniel Carter was building something worth joining. He thought about Sandra scheduling the Rotterdam call at 7 in the morning and never complaining about the hour because she understood what the hour meant and why it mattered. He thought about Lily throwing a dish towel at him over the kitchen sink, He thought about the captain's voice across the deck of the Aurora. Daniel Carter is the owner of this vessel. I thought about all of it. The 15 years, the work, the early mornings and the late nights and the moments of doubt that he had processed privately and resolved practically. The 1,000 decisions made correctly in the dark when nobody was watching and nobody would ever know. And he understood something that he had always understood intellectually, but was now understanding the way you understand things that have finally completed their full journey from the mind to the chest. It had been worth it. Not because of the partnership, not because of the yacht or the investors or the Monday morning in New York. Because of who he had become in the building of it. Because of the man Lily called on Thursdays and drove down to see on Sundays. Because of the father who showed up and stayed and never once made his daughter carry the weight of his own unresolved grief. That was the real thing he'd built. Everything else was just the structure around it. 6 months after the Greystone partnership closed, Carter Maritime Group announced the acquisition of its first European vessel, a newly certified cargo passenger hybrid operating in the North Sea corridor, brought into the portfolio under the phased entry framework that Daniel had restructured in the conference room in New York with a whiteboard marker and 40 minutes of solitude before anyone else arrived. The acquisition was covered in 2 trade publications and 1 financial newsletter. Daniel read all 3 pieces, corrected a factual error in his head that none of them had gotten quite right, and went back to work. Marcus sent a congratulatory email at 7 in the morning on the day the acquisition closed. Sandra brought 2 cups of coffee without being asked. 3 members of the Rotterdam crew sent a group message that was enthusiastic and only slightly grammatically accurate, which Daniel found charming in the way of things that are genuine before they are polished. He responded to all of them personally. He was at his desk by 6:45 that morning, the same desk in the same Charleston office that had expanded over the years from 1 room to 4, and now occupied the entire 2nd floor of a building that he owned outright. Outside the harbor moved with its constant indifferent industry. Vessels coming in. Vessels going out. The machinery of commerce that had fascinated a boy on a pier in Beaufort and never stopped fascinating the man he'd become. He opened the day's operations log. He started reading. At 9:30, Sandra knocked on his doorway. He looked up. "Lily's professor called," she said. Her expression was the carefully neutral one she used when she was trying not to look amused. "The William and Mary Business School. He wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to his capital markets class." Daniel looked at her. "About what?" he said. Sandra held up a printed email. "About, and I'm reading directly, the Carter Maritime Group Acquisition Framework as a case study in phased international expansion." She lowered the paper. Apparently one of his students submitted it as a methodology reference, and it generated significant discussion. Daniel looked at the paper. "I thought about Lily on the phone 6 months ago saying you're going in the methodology section with the cheerful authority of someone who had already decided and was informing rather than requesting." He said nothing for a moment. Sandra waited. "Tell him yes," Daniel said. She started to turn. "Sandra." She turned back. "Tell him it needs to be in the afternoon. I have a Rotterdam call in the morning." She smiled her real smile, the one she reserved for moments that justified it. "Of course you do." She went back to her desk. Daniel looked at the operations log. He thought about standing in front of a room full of students, young people at the beginning of the part of their lives where they would decide what kind of work they were going to do and what kind of people they were going to be while doing it, and he thought about what he would say to them. What single thing, if he could give them only one, would be worth the hour? He already knew the answer. He'd known it since a kitchen table in Savannah with Pete Garrison's operations reports spread around a sleeping house. Do the work. Not the performance of the work. Not the announcement of the work. Not the networking around the edges of the work, or the positioning adjacent to the work, or the careful cultivation of the appearance of having done the work. The actual unglamorous early morning, late night, nobody watching, nobody clapping work. The work that exists whether or not anyone knows about it. The work that compounds slowly and surely, and without drama, into something that cannot be faked because it took too long to fake. Do that work. Everything else will become apparent on its own schedule. He closed the operations log. He opened his email. He had 17 messages to answer, a Rotterdam timeline to approve, and a call with Warren Shields at 2 o'clock about the next phase of the Greystone framework. He started at the top. At 6:45 the next morning, he was at his desk again. The harbor moved outside his window, the way it always moved. The work was on his desk, the way it always was. Sandra's coffee was on its way, the way it always was. Nothing about the morning announced itself as remarkable. That was the point. That had always been the point. Somewhere on the East Coast. The Aurora was in her berth, with her lines secure, and her crew resting and her engines quiet, carrying the unremarkable fact of belonging to someone, not as a trophy, not as a symbol, not as evidence of anything, but as a working asset in a functioning operation, run by a man who understood better than almost anyone that the difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that doesn't has nothing to do with how loudly you talk about it. It has everything to do with whether the work underneath it is real. Daniel Carter's